Never Too Old. Narrated by Edward Kitchen and Owen Hurrell. Brought to you by Edo Projects. Copyright Edo Projects 2020. Terry and Deborah were doing what they always did before a flash and dash, arguing.
"No, you get it ale,"
Terry hissed.
"I would if I had one,"
Deborah replied. It was embarrassing. 10 years back, you wouldn't have heard a peep out of either of them. They were both consummate professionals. No words were needed. They would just hop out and get on with it. But Deborah's demeanour had soured as of late, as if she sensed that she didn't have many more robberies in her. Terry was balding. He had paunch, and the idea of exposing himself to an unsuspecting public no longer appealed to him. It's not that Terry used to be a pervert. Far from it. He would say he was a gentleman, refusing, as he did, to let Deborah bear all in his place. He was simply a crook, using the tools at hand. But now he had come to the point of practically begging her to whap out her baps. Chivalry be damned. Come on, he would say, just once. One jiggle and you'll mesmerize the whole bloody street. Deborah declined, as a lady should. But Deborah was no lady, and perhaps never had been. And so the subject of who would bear all had become a bone of contention. They waited, crouched behind the bushes opposite the Greyhound bus station, where a hot dog vendor was busy at work and had no idea of the torrent of obscenity that was shortly to be visited upon him.
"For God's sake, no, never mind, God. For me. Get him out for me, Deborah. I beg you."
Today, as usual, Terry's pleas fell on deaf ears.
"For the millionth time, I've told you, nobody cares about your beer gut,"
Deborah said. Terry winced. Did she have to put it like that? He knew he'd grown fat recently, but he was an old man. Was he supposed to be ripped?
"I care, Deborah, okay? I don't want people seeing my exposed body anymore. Women, man, the children, Deborah. Oh, please think of the children."
Deborah grabbed him by the collar.
"We are in the shark and oar business, Terry. You of all people should know that. What happened to you? You were all balls back in the day."
"We're not young anymore, Deborah. We've been at this, 25, 30 years now? Sure, it was a fine enough way to make a living back in the day, but whipping out your weed whacker is a young man's game. Nobody, I repeat, nobody wants to see my schmonks."
"You're right about that,"
Deborah replied.
"but that's the point, ain't it? We want them to be shocked. You being an old coot just adds to the potency, don't it? All those dangly bits, the disgust, the revulsion, that's what's going to stun them in time for me to grab the cash. I can't move as quick as I used to. What with these knees?"
Terry knew all about Deborah's knees. He had a whole back catalogue of useless information about them stuck in his brain, in fact, going back over 2 decades. There was a time where he'd loved Deborah, knees and all, but that time was not now. When he looked at what she had become, a haggard old wench crouching in some bushes in the hope of robbing a hot dog vendor of his hard-earned chicken scratch, he felt numb.
"Right. Pull it out and dazzle that man,"
Deborah said, pointing to the vendor.
"That meat spinner trick, you know, should do the job."
Terry regarded the man through the leaves of the bush. He didn't know what type of man the vendor was, but he seemed at peace, happy, and Terry was about to ruin it all.
"Come on, whip out your meal ticket. Let's get this show on the road,"
Deborah croaked. Ashamedly, he unfastened the belt of his overcoat and tugged out his length. Deborah didn't even take a glance. She would say she'd seen it enough. Terry couldn't imagine the old battle axe being shocked at anything anymore, especially the sight of a man's nethers. She was dead inside, all greed and hate. Still, he hesitated.
Go on,
She rasped.
fuck off out there and get to work. My knees are locked up squatting here.
Terry took a deep breath, as you must when forcing your body to perform an action against its will, and stood. He didn't know why, but he had an erection. Possibly a bonus, or was it overkill? Would it simply serve to scar the vendor's mind more? Leaving the trench coat behind, he jabbered out from behind the bush towards the hot dog stall, naked, his flagpole wagging rhythmically to a tune of its own beat. An innocent bystander caught a glimpse first, her scream cutting through the otherwise crisp, clean, beautiful day. How many victims before this day is through? Terry asked himself. The vendor was halfway through slotting a dog in a bun when the scream caused him to look up, and he immediately locked eyes on Terry's swinging tent pole.
Holy hell, mister! Get that thing away from my truck, man! Food safety! You're gonna get me shut down!
The vendor turned red in the face, furiously pumping his fists up and down. Terry's cock often had that effect on people, even when flaccid. But now it was at its zenith. It could be perceived as an offensive weapon, albeit in the hands of a man who had no intention of using it in anger. As Terry stood there, he found himself wondering where the hell Deborah was. Then, locking eyes with the vendor and using his peripheral vision so as not to let on to the vendor where his wife was, he spotted her out the corner of his eye. God, she was moving slowly, and yet her lack of speed made her all the more conspicuous. The bright pink tank top didn't help either. Creeping wasn't her style as of late. As mentioned, she didn't have the knees. Surely the old goat could move faster than that, Terry thought, or at least stick to the shadows. More people were being attracted by the strange scene. Passers-by stopped to air their disgust at Terry's soggy body. He felt shame. Mothers in the vicinity shielded the eyes of their children. Even the dogs seemed to turn away in disgust. The whole thing had become a perverse circus. Terry thought that at least someone might have laughed, but no. Everyone was deadly serious. Deborah was behind the vendor now, moving along the sidewalk like an injured mule. Her progress was slow but steady. The vendor's cash box would be within her reach in a few seconds. Terry knew he had to ramp it up a bit. Now at half-mast, he began doing jumping jacks. The flapping sound of his junk hitting his belly was enough to renew the vendor's mesmerized revulsion.
Come on, man! Think about what you're doing!
The vendor shook his head. He was now past rage and was regarding Terry with a kind of vivid display of pity. Deborah was now a foot behind the man. If he stepped back, or even caught a whiff of the old sow, the jig was up. Drastic measures were needed. Terry approached the stall, slowly, one foot in front of the other, thrusting the air as he went, and making noises similar to a yak in mating season.
Feast your eyes! Oh, no, man, no! Stay back, you hear?
Cried the vendor.
I'm going to call the cops, man. You're taking this too far. Leave now or I'm going to stack you with my poker.
He stepped around in front of the stall, thinking to put himself in between his food and the grave threat to the hygiene rating of his stall. He brandished a large, perfectly sharpened barbecue fork with a polished wood handle that looked like it could do severe damage to any man's junk. Terry imagined the vendor had seen off many a man with that fork. That fork had seen things.
Oh, don't you dare look away. The show's just beginning.
Terry paused, but kept gyrating and thrusting, slapping his bits against his thigh and grunting. A look of abject disgust had never left the vendor's face, but now it intensified. How long would it remain once this was all over? Terry wondered. He didn't mean to, but he glanced over the vendor's shoulder to check on Deborah's progress. Perhaps he had known, deep down in his bowels, that he would give the game away. He was tired, after all. Tired of Deborah's constant nagging, constant orders to pull it out and wave it all about wherever she saw fit. What was he, anyway? Some sort of nudist slave? He resolved then and there that this would be his last flash and dash. He just couldn't keep doing this to innocent people anymore. It was then, while he was lost in thought, that the vendor caught the look in his eye and turned to catch Deborah, hand in his box.
"Hey, you! You old piece of ham! Get out of there! Get out!"
Deborah spat in the vendor's face, a good shot that caught him right in the eye. He recoiled, shook his head, and thrust the barbecue fork into her forearm. Deborah let out a bird-like squawk. Things were escalating quickly, Terry realized. Despite how much he loathed her, despite how much he wished she'd died long ago, in that moment, something washed over him. Something primal. He couldn't help but protect her. He didn't think, he just reacted, and before he knew it, he was riding the vendor like a cheap Poughkeepsie Bronco.
Go on now, get down now. Oh, he's a strong one.
The vendor was now in a high state of agitation, waving the fork around, trying to stick Terry any place he could. Clearly, the fact he knew Terry was naked agitated him even more. He could feel the heat of the old man's flesh on his back.
"Get off me, you old fuck!"
The vendor flipped Terry over his shoulder and onto the hot dog stall's grill. Terry's back bacon began to sizzle, and he let out a canine-like yelp before rolling off to the ground.
Oh, no.
Deborah had torn off a piece of her t-shirt and tied it around her wrist to stem the bleeding. Now she moved around the side of the stall. The vendor was taking his shirt off on account of the fact that he didn't want to be wearing any of Terry's old man stains. As he was pulling it over his head, Deborah hauled back and kicked him firmly in the ghoulies, and he went to his knees, doubled over. She grabbed his head and pushed his face onto the hot dog griddle, cooking him like a side of beef. The vendor's screams woke Terry. He'd been taking an accidental nap on account of the extreme pain from his own grilling. He got to his feet, shakily, just in time to see the vendor hook Deborah hard in the crotch. And she stumbled back as the vendor, now shirtless as well, with a bright red face, thrust the barbecue fork directly into Deborah's thorax like a champion fencer. Which, in fact, he used to be, although there's no way the two old coots could have known so at the time.
"Hey, do you like that, do you? Is this what you wanted, you old fucking sow?"
Deborah? Deborah!
Again, Terry thought he would have felt ecstatic to see his wife stabbed. After all, he'd thought about killing her in numerous ways over the years. But when it came to it, he didn't think at all. He went numb all over. The rage enveloped him, and before he could form a cohesive thought, he had walked up behind the vendor and calmly snapped his neck. The vendor hit the concrete like a sack of bricks. Spinal cord severed, gaping mouth contorted like a bull mid-coitus.
That's what you get!
Terry found himself yelling at the vendor's corpse. That damn woman screamed somewhere again, but Terry didn't hear. He just stood there, nude, transfixed by his own handiwork. What had he become? A disgruntled, saggy Freddy Krueger. Nothing but a naked old killer in the street. He looked among the faces of the crowd, abject horror painted everywhere. Was it worth the conjuring of this horror scene for a few dollars? So dismayed was he by the way things had turned out, that he failed to notice sirens wailing. Before he knew it, police were yelling at him to get on the ground. But Terry wasn't there anymore. He was above it all, looking down at himself, and he hated what he saw. A mad, bad old man killer, twice as bold as the day he was born and just as naked. Which was fitting, because this was the day he was going to leave the world. He felt the weight of years upon him, and had long decided that jail was not for him. Slowly he turned, screwing up his face into a vicious snarl. He raised a two-finger salute to the law, and as the cops aimed, gave one last determined thrust of his fleshy spear. The cops fired. Their aim was true, and Terry Jenkins, probably the last great American hero, joined his wife in death. Despite all the horror that the two had caused over their prolific careers, the people of the town developed a begrudging respect for the couple. They had stolen close to $1 million all in all. Today, 20 years on, if you go down to the spot where all this happened, next to the statue of a golden hot dog stall honouring the town's favourite vendor who fought and died there, you'll find a bench dedicated to what old Deborah and Terry really represented. Freedom. This has been a reading of Never Too Old, brought to you by Edo Projects. Copyright Edo Projects 2020.